Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the 189th episode of Tones Takes. I'm going to try to do this in under 5 minutes. The U.S. is under hot water, primarily the Department of Health and Human Services and some other diplomats who went to the World Health Organization last month, and apparently they threatened some countries, second, third world countries like Ecuador and who knows who else. Ecuador mainly because they wanted to make some provisions that would basically, put an end to some of the terrible marketing practices around breast milk substitutes, like formula. The U.S., if you don't know, is rife with breast making formula companies like Abbott, Nestle, which is from Switzerland, has a huge presence here in the U.S., as well as Mead Johnson, which all of them combined, it's about a $70 billion industry when you think about it. And so it was interesting because according to the New York Times, which is the only source, every news article that I read, they all reference New York Times. And so I just hate when stuff like that happens. And I also have to say New York Times had like no sources of who they were talking to. No one wanted to speak. Everyone was anonymous, which also just does not help me with the credence of the story. But basically they said American officials sought to water down a resolution by removing language that called on governments to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. And another passage that called on policymakers to restrict the promotion of food products that many experts say can have deleterious effects on children. So that's pretty much what this all says here, and it boggles my mind because I'm like, well, what American officials and who in Ecuador? I mean, they're just not saying too much. But anyway, there was also another thing that said, in addition, there were threats made by Todd Chapman. He is our, what would you call him? I can't remember the name of it. Basically, he's the representative, the U.S. Ambassador to Ecuador. And he basically suggested in meetings with officials in Quito that, among other things, the Trump administration might retaliate by withdrawing military assistance, and that's this guy right here. If you need to know what he looks like, just in case you see him in the street, this guy acting like he's actually a native there. Basically saying that the Trump administration would withdraw military assistance that it's been providing in northern Ecuador, which is a reason that's been getting a lot of violence, which is one of the main reasons why we see a lot of people migrating here to the United States. So it's just kind of crazy all this is happening. And then Patty Randall, who is a policy director for this breast advocacy group called Baby Milk Action in England, this is like the only person that they were actually able to get a source from, the New York Times. Basically, she said she was saddened by the behavior of the delegates. She said what happened was tantamount to blackmail, with the U.S. holding the world hostage and trying to overturn nearly 40 years of consensus on the best way to protect infant and your child. So again, a lot of stuff happening, but I started digging a little bit, and I'm not sure if the U.S. could even really do much about this. There's this report that's come out. There's the status report, which is probably the basis for a lot of the conversation. It's called Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, National Implementation of the International Code. And the International Code that it's talking about was actually written way back in 1981. If you can see that there, 1981. The World Health Organization put together this code, and this code has 11 articles in it. And it's interesting because it basically starts by saying, believing that in light of the foregoing, and they bring up a whole bunch of things, the foregoing considerations, and in view of the vulnerability of infants in the early months of life and the risks involved, and inappropriate feeding practices, including the unnecessary and improper use of breast milk substitutes, the marketing of breast milk substitutes requires special treatment, which makes usual marketing practices unsuitable for these products. So I really do wonder if this has already been, put together by the World Health Organization, what more did Ecuador bring to the table? No one has talked about what this resolution really said in its entirety. All they say is Ecuador brought it forth, the U.S. shot it down. No other countries wanted to bring it forth for fear that the U.S. might also retaliate the way they said they would retaliate with Ecuador. But then Russia, of all countries, came to the rescue and was able to push this resolution through. So I'm not quite sure what the resolution was, but I'm also not quite sure what they needed beyond the 11 articles, which if you read, I'll try to put a link to this 24-page International Code of Marketing of breast milk substitutes, again, written in 1981. I'll put a link to that. So I'm not sure what more was needed from this. But again, I'm not picking a side here because, again, the U.S. Is terrible for not backing this. Obviously, we are more focused on the money than anything, even if it comes at the expense of people in third world countries that are trying to learn how to breastfeed their children and properly care for them. Because in my view, breastfeeding is the best way to take care of your child. So why the U.S., why the diplomats would try to stop that is not beyond me. It's all about the money and the lobbyists that were there at the World Health Organization, basically trying to ensure that they could get their breast milk substitutes into those countries. So it's pretty scary. It's also pretty scary because I just watched like Avengers, or not Avengers, Marvel's Agents of Shield, and I'm in like the 5th season where they talk about how the food that people were given is basically rendering them unable to have babies. So it's just interesting things like that that scare me when corporate interests become too entangled in the health of human beings. So hopefully, whatever did actually happen comes to light. I'm over my time limit, but let me know what you guys think of this story. Is the U.S. right? I'm sure most of you will say no. Is there another side to this story that we don't know about? Obviously, like I said, I think that the 11 articles that were put together back in 1981, if you read through them, they seem pretty robust. So I'm not sure what else Ecuador and some of these other countries were really trying to push through, and I would like to actually know. And I need the New York Times to come up with some more sources or kind of prod some of these people to come forward. I mean, I'm all about transparency. If you think the U.S. is going to retaliate, well, then put your name out there. And if they do retaliate, then that's the U.S. and we're going to be in some real deep trouble. But I am not for anything that goes against the health and well-being of mothers and babies. So I'm not a happy day to be an American for me. But let me know what you guys think about this story, and I will see you all tomorrow. Peace out.